Welcome everyone, Questini here with the discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires with patch 4.0 and to talk about the recommended campaigns for new players. Whether or not you're just starting with Total War or you've played Total War games before and you're just getting into Total War Warhammer 3, I do want to talk about the actual recommended first campaigns for new players. Now, I am assuming people are not going to have DLC when they're doing so. Maybe they do decide to buy a couple of them, the cheaper ones, if they're on a discount. Maybe they don't buy any of them, and that's certainly going to determine which Legendary Lords I am going to put on this list. This is very similar to the very first video I did on Immortal Empires. In fact, it's the reason I started covering Immortal Empires and have been covering with hundreds of videos Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires since then, because I was looking at this list of recommended first campaigns and I was just laughing at the recommendations Creative Assembly has. And it's still hilarious, honestly, that a year after launch of Immortal Empires, they still haven't changed this list. So, for Warhammer 1, because the way they've made this list, at least this is how I view it, they chose a campaign from each of the games that made sense to them. I'm not sure how it made sense to them because they're not great choices, except one. Like, out of 3 choices, only one is good, but the other 2 are, like, not great, to say the least. For Warhammer 1, you have Karl Franz. Now, in Warhammer 1, even to this day, Karl Franz is a good campaign for a beginner. It is not a good campaign for a beginner in Warhammer 3. This is because the complications of Imperial authority, the issues the Empire has, just overall issues that Karl Franz has to deal with in a campaign. It is really a campaign for a veteran player to dive into. Now in Warhammer 2, believe it or not, Karl Franz would still be fine for the most part, though I would not recommend it still for a new player since the Imperial rework. I guess it makes sense to have Karl Franz. He's kind of like the face of the game at the very least, if not the face of Warhammer Fantasy, alongside Sigmar, but still is not a great decision given the way his campaign works. I've talked a lot about the Empire, I'm not going to repeat myself, but the Empire is not in a great state. For Warhammer 2, you do have a great choice, and the only one that really makes sense on this list, and that is Tyrion. Tyrion has always had a good campaign. Now, there are some issues with this campaign. I wouldn't say it's the best campaign for a new player, given some of the issues people that don't have DLC for the High Elves will encounter, but certainly a very good choice over here, and the only really good choice on this list. And then you have Miao Ying for Grand Cafe. Originally, and I'm pretty certain that Creative Assembly designed Warhammer 3 with this in mind, it used to be Katrin for Kislev. That didn't work out. So when Realms of Chaos came out, they recommended Katrin. Shortly thereafter, they realized Kislev is not a race for a beginner player. So now they're recommending Miao Ying for Grand Cafe. Now, Miao Ying is fine, especially with the change to the Harmony system in patch 4.0, but she's not the best Warhammer 3 campaign for a beginner player. She's not even the best Grand Cafean campaign for a beginner player. The hilarity of it all is if I go over here to Realms of Chaos, they actually recommend a better choice for Realms of Chaos, and that's Zhao Ming, and he's a much better choice than Miao Ying in Immortal Empires as well. I kind of feel bad about Miao Ying because, like, she was the face of Grand Cafe, and it's like she's now become the worst Legendary Lord of Grand Cafe. What is it with Creative Assembly, with the baseline, with the default Legendary Lords of a lot of races, that they actually end up being the worst in a lot of ways? Like, Karl Franz is the worst Legendary Lord for the Empire. Miao Ying is now the worst Legendary Lord of Grand Cafe. Katrin is the worst Legendary Lord of Kislev. It didn't used to be like that. Like, if you look back at Warhammer 2, the baseline Legendary Lord was always a great choice. The secondary ones, like Morathi for the Dark Elves, like if we look at the Dark Elves as a comparison, like you had Malekith and Morathi as 2 starting Legendary Lords for the Dark Elves. And while Morathi always had a lot of campaign potential, her campaign was always more complicated than Malekith. If you could pull it off, you would end up in a stronger position. But Malekith was always the better choice when you were playing your first campaign, partly starting position, effects, not having the complicated starting position that Morathi had in Warhammer 2, and the one she still has in Warhammer 2, not so much in Warhammer 3. So, with that in mind, let me go over a proper list of campaigns that I would highly recommend for a new player. Keeping in mind that when you're recommending a campaign, this is my perspective on it, you do want people to learn the game. You don't just want people to pick up, I don't know, you don't want people to just pick up Be'lakor, which they can, by the way. Everyone has access to Be'lakor. You don't want them to just pick up Be'lakor and steamroll the entire campaign map with no opposition. They're not going to learn jack shit from doing so. So you do want to give people a campaign where they are going to have a gameplay experience, where they are going to figure things out. A comparison I'd give is like the Huns in Age of Empires 2. The Huns are a good choice, like are an easier race to pick up because they don't have to bother with housing Age of Empires 2. But that's precisely the reason why a new player shouldn't play them, because every other race has to deal with that. If you're playing Be'lakor, you don't have to deal with a lot of the campaign situations that every other race has to deal with outside of the Warriors of Chaos. So not a great campaign for a beginner player. So let's go over the actual list. And number 5 on this list is Isabella von Karstein or Vlad von Karstein, whichever one you choose. Isabella does have better faction effects than Vlad. But if you play Vlad, you get Isabella as a legendary hero. If you play Isabella, you get her as the legendary lord with Vlad as a legendary hero. The advantage of playing Isabella is that Vlad will start with both of his armies. And crucially, the von Karstein ring, which means that he'll almost instantly recover from being killed in a battle. Vlad can't die. I'm sure anyone who's played Warhammer 3 understands exactly the frustration there is in terms of dealing with Vlad because of that ring. Now, here's why the vampire counts are great choices. Now, Vlad and Isabella are great choices because they have a relatively decent starting position. While the factions around them, the dwarves and Empire, don't particularly like them, you do have ways of dealing with that. And crucially, when we're talking about diplomacy, and this is one of the reasons I recommend it, you can vassalize factions via diplomacy. So this is a good campaign to get you started on pretty much all the aspects when it comes to diplomacy. Dealing with factions that don't necessarily like you, but you can make them like you via trading territory, taking territory, selling it to them, vassalizing them. Like you can make your best friend in this particular campaign if you play your cards right. And hell, you can make the Empire love you in this campaign because you do have access to the Lamian vampire bloodlines. Like with the vampire counts, you have the blood kisses. The more blood kisses you get, the more of these special lords you get. These guys are immortal, so you'll unlock free lords, 3 of these special lords for each of these bloodlines. That can end up with a significant amount of benefits, like diplomatic relations plus 30 with the Empire, like Winds of Magic benefit, upkeep, campaign line of sight, vampiric corruption, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of choices, and none of them are necessarily bad choices either. Like, that's the thing with the vampire counts. There are many ways to play them, but none of those decisions that you do have when it comes to building your army, selecting your lord, selecting your heroes are bad choices. Like, a lot of things work. A lot of different playstyles work for the vampire counts. This is also a great campaign for people to deal with the corruption situation, because vampires do need to operate in corruption. Otherwise, they will take attrition, indicated by the skull over there and the moot over here. So you have a good deal of potential. Now, you don't have ranged or artillery when you're playing as vampires. Your units aren't necessarily the best in the world. Your economy is good, but not necessarily the best. Like, it is a fairly decent state overall, you might think, but there is a ridiculous amount of power as well. You don't have global recruitment, you have the ability of raising the dead. Now, this is great for a new player because it allows you to experiment with different types of units, because you can get tier 5 units through Raise the Dead. The way it works is you get the randomized chance and territory you're in, but if you fight a major battle against a foe, you can raise some really high level units. Like if we look at the vampire count unit roster, you can get things up to Blood Knights in your campaign, and that is pretty substantial. Also, another reason to recommend the vampire counts is that they only have one paid DLC, so you can get access to pretty much everything they have. If you just buy that DLC. But even without that, you're not necessarily missing a significant amount, even without that particular piece of DLC. Though it is obviously the complete race if you do have it. But overall, it's a fairly good situation. You do have a lot more power, you have a lot of potential, but you're also vulnerable. Of course, it's not necessarily the best race to recommend for new players because you can kind of overextend yourself. One of the issues that you might encounter in Vampire Count's campaigns is that you recruit a very high tier army and then your economy collapses because you went too far. So balance is needed here. You need to learn how to deal with that, even as an experienced player. And I think it is a great campaign as either Isabella or Vlad to get to know the game mechanics like trading, diplomacy, building armies, balancing those armies between having really powerful armies, but also armies you can afford, and also having a lot of armies as well on the campaign map to deal with everything you're going to have to tackle in this particular campaign. So highly recommended to begin with. Not as good as some of the other campaigns on this list because obviously there are limitations on the vampires, ranged artillery, the attrition situation, the diplomatic aversion. But I would strongly recommend playing this particular campaign, especially if you're starting out as a new player in Total War Warhammer 3. At number 4, we have Grimgor. Grimgor has always been a fun campaign to play all the way back to Warhammer 1. There was certainly a period of time in Warhammer 2 in particular where he was faltering, but because the Greenskins in general were faltering as they were left behind by Creative Assembly until the massive Greenskin rework. Now the Greenskins are one of the best races in the game and a fairly simplistic race to play in a lot of ways. They can trade, they make a lot of money through individual battles, they have powerful armies, they get powerful faction effects, they get powerful lords. What is there not to like about the Greenskins? They can also get heroes very, very quickly in their campaign with their heroes available at a fairly low tier. Like when you're thinking about Black Orc Big Bosses, they're at tier 3. When you're thinking about Giant River Troll Hags, which are a DLC hero, they're at tier 3. Shamans are tier 3 as well. So you'll be getting a lot of heroes, with the exception of Goblin Big Bosses, which require tier 4 settlement to increase capacity, but they don't matter as much. They're the worst heroes anyway. The Greenskins are great to play with or without DLC. DLC does give some new units that are important, in particular Nasty Skulkers that you can recruit from any tier 2 barracks, and are one of the best melee units in the early game, in the entirety of Total War Warhammer 3. And also Stone Trolls from the Warden and Punch DLC. So you got the Skarsnik DLC, the King and the Warlord DLC for Nasty Skulkers. You got the Warden and the Punch DLC. If I had to pick between the two of them, I'd say Warden and Punch is more important because Stone Trolls and Giant River Troll Hags are far more significant. But don't underestimate the potential of having Nasty Skulkers. Though you'll do just fine without Nasty Skulkers, just go with a bunch of the boys or go with a bunch of Goblin Archers, or if you want to play full-on Greenskin, yeah, go for Orc Archer boys if you so desire. Personally, I think it's a fairly silly decision to limit yourself like that. People say, oh, Grimgor shouldn't use Goblins. I'm like, he did use Goblins in the lore, he just didn't like them. That there's a difference between the two of them. And he especially used them early on, and then he just killed them all. Which, by the way, is kind of reflective of how you want to play a Greenskin campaign, I might add. Because early on in a Greenskin campaign, yeah, you do want to use a lot of Goblins, Nasty Skulkers, Goblin Archers, but later on you want to swap them out. Especially the Nasty Skulkers. You want to get Black Orcs, you want to get potentially Savage Orcs when you're thinking about Archers. Or you might want to go with the full-on melee army. That also works for Greenskins pretty well. Or switch up the Night Goblins. That's your choice. The idea that Grimgor never used Goblins, it's like, he did. And then he lost the battle because they were too bad, so it's like he just switched to an elite army. Which is pretty interesting when you think about it. Because obviously, that has always been the case in Total War, that you would start with some early game units, and then as you progress through your campaign, you would just get rid of them. And then you have Grimgor's lore, and this was developed long before Creative Assembly and Games Workshop had any kind of agreement. And then you have Grimgor's lore, where Grimgor, in the lore, he started out with a whole kind of units, but in particular Black Orcs, but Goblins, others. And then he just made an entire elite army when he lost the battle. I believe it was Kislev, if I'm not mistaken. Or against Krom. That's a different discussion. So the way you want to play Grimgor in the game kind of mirrors how he handled things in the lore as well. Never mind how he ended up being, leading ogres, goblins, orcs, how hobgoblins to glory as the Beastwa in the end times. Grimgor is really powerful. He has campaign movement range. He gets an upkeep benefit for Black Orcs and Big Guns, so those are your top infantry units. His Was can get Black Orcs in them, which is actually the best Wa unit that you can get. He has a great deal of dueling capability. He gets more heroes in the Black Orc big bosses for his special skill line. He has Frenzy. He gets further benefits to Orc Big Guns and Savage Orc Big Guns, as well as bonus versus large. He causes fear and terror and has 8 HP. Vitamin shrooms. Gotta take those vitamins, right? So Grimgor is fun. And it's not just that he's really powerful. It's also that he's powerful, but he's also in one of the best campaign areas of the game, which is the Darklands, or rather the northern part of the mountains more, but also Darklands. He's surrounded by pretty powerful legendary lords. Astrogoth, Kolek, Zaytan. Further to the southwest, you've got Drazif, you've got Imric, and then you have the dwarves. So regardless of which way you're moving in this campaign, you will encounter foes. And how you deal with that, how you expand, which fights you decide to take on, who you decide to ally, how you decide to build your empire, all of that is going to have a great deal of significance in Grimgor's campaign. There's an enormous amount of potential if you do it properly. And this is one of the ways a campaign should be for a new player, where you have an immense amount of potential, but it's not just a cakewalk. It's not just a free ride. Don't get me wrong, if you're a highly veteran player, it is a free ride in a lot of ways. But if you're a new player and you're learning things, there's a lot of potential in this campaign to figure out the game and really be rewarded for it, which I think is a fairly important aspect of any good campaign for a new player. As opposed to campaigns that are just smashing your head against a brick wall. Just look at Kislev as an example. At number 3, we have Tyrion of the High Elves. The High Elves are a great race for beginners. They're a good race in general. They have a lot of campaign power. They have a lot of campaign potential. Their basic army of spearmen and archers are really good. DLC units just add on top of that. But you can certainly play an entire High Elven campaign with a baseline roster and do quite well, even within the context of Immortal Empires, even against really powerful legendary lords. So that's one of the things that Tyrion has really going for him. He has one of the best or easiest starting position in the entire game, with a significant amount of campaign potential from the very beginning of his campaign. He has a lot of power. He has good benefits in terms of recruitment duration, construction time for the Shrine of Cain, so you can get the Sword of Cain, even though the wasteland over here is uninhabitable, so that could be a problem, though he does have that benefit. And crucially, he gets a diplomatic relations benefit with other High Elves. Then he has the Majesty of Ulfwan, which gives him further diplomatic relations control, income from all buildings, recruitment costs, global recruitment duration -1 turn, minimum 1, global recruitment capacity, and a -10% upkeep for all armies. So that really helps the scalability. The High Elves are a great race to play because they are all about diplomacy to make their economy work. So if you're playing a High Elven campaign, you want to get a bunch of trade agreements with factions, and you want to maintain those trade agreements. So you're building relationships that are long-lasting. Vlad and Isabella are more about abusing diplomacy. The High Elves are more about actually having partnerships with respect to that, and making those partnerships work in a particular campaign. So they do want to build up. The reason they care about that is they build their main economic building, produces tradable resources, elven trinkets, and these obviously you need to sell to other factions via trade agreements. So they're producing tradable resources, more factions will be willing to trade with them. They also have a great deal of potential in terms of diplomacy because of the influence system. There are downsides because lords and heroes with good stats do require you to spend influence, otherwise you get a negative trait. My advice with that, get ridiculed. Like if you get to actually I think I might even just take this lord and potentially save her if that were to be the case, or just get lords that actually have positive effects. I think that's bugged, by the way. Yeah, there are certain bugs or certain changes that Creative Assembly has implemented in patch 4.0. Now, there are a couple of downsides. The High Elven baseline playstyle is fairly solid for Tyrion in particular. He's a powerful lord. He's a powerful melee combatant. I'm sure you're noticing a pattern that I've recommended melee lords up until this point. There are a couple of issues, though. One, the High Elves need to get to tier 4 settlements, or even tier 5 settlements to increase... tier 4, to increase their hero capacity. And that will limit the potential in your campaign, because it may end up being difficult to really get a significant number of heroes throughout the course of your campaign. And also, the best hero they have, the Handmaiden of the Everqueen, is a DLC hero exclusively. Now, that's not the reason why I'm not putting Tyrion higher on the list. Like, in terms of learning a lot of mechanics, in terms of dealing with diplomacy, because you do have various factions over here on Wolf One, and how you deal with them diplomatically is important, because you don't ultimately want to confederate them. But the reason I'm not placing Tyrion higher on this list is because you actually need to own the DLC to make that work. Based on what I know, correct me if I'm wrong, because keep in mind, I obviously am playing with all of the DLC here, but based on what plenty of people have told me, you do need to own Alariel's DLC to be able to confederate her. You need to own Elfarian's DLC to confederate him. So without those DLCs, you're never going to be able to confederate them, which does limit your potential in the campaign. But otherwise, it is a fairly good campaign. It is a great campaign. It is just limited if you're playing the baseline game. If you have the DLC, it is arguably the best campaign for a beginner player. If you do own those DLCs, if you do have the extra units, the extra heroes, the extra lord, the Archmages in particular, because the Archmage is a DLC lord that's only available for the Warden and the Punch. Like, just get Warden and the Punch. Like, two of the lords on this list do benefit quite a bit from that. It is a really good piece of DLC in general, like what it does for the High Elves and what it does for the Greenskins. Highly recommended for that one, for any player. If you're looking to learn game, if you're looking to play two races that are really good for beginners, that's a highly recommended DLC. So Tyrion, great lord, good choices, great campaign position, lots of potential, good amount of flexibility. And the High Elves are the kind of race that builds strength as you play them in a campaign. So building a massive empire as them is what they excel at in their campaign. And yet they're still pretty good in the early game because, again, spearmen and archers with light armor are very good early game units. They lack the armor piercing or the melee killing capability. Spearmen are good line holders and are good at killing things in melee, but again, fairly effective at getting the job done. And number 2 is Morathi of the Dark Elves. And I have to say that all the people that came out when Warhammer 3 launched, Immortal Empires launched, and slammed Creative Assembly for the changes to the Dark Elves, honestly, I think they were very wrong. And with the Forge of the Chaos Dwarves, they even made the Dark Elves far stronger than they were before. Yes, I understand they don't have the same ridiculousness of the slave economy as they did in Warhammer 2, but in terms of the early game, in terms of just dominating a campaign, very few races can compare to the Dark Elves, and very few Legendary Lords compare to Morathi. Honestly, Morathi is more of a Slaaneshi Legendary Lord than the actual Slaaneshi Legendary Lord. She's beloved on the campaign map. To explain the reason behind that, it has to do with the fact that the Dark Elves are not really hated by that many races. The Lizardmen have an aversion, and many Order factions have a -40 aversion, but -40 is something you can deal with. It's really when you start getting into -100 that the problems start really scaling up. And the Disorder factions, Skaven, Chaos, etc., they might even love you potentially, or have only a -10 aversion. This means you have a ridiculous amount of diplomatic potential at your hands. You don't have the ability of vassalizing factions, but considering what Morathi can do in her campaign, you don't need to. Because you can become one of the most powerful dominant factions in the world and ally the entire world. You want to ally Archeon and Kislev at the same time? You can do it as Morathi. It's pretty absurd, pretty ridiculous. And even the High Elves, the mortal foes of the Dark Elves, well, there's a particular landmark over here that gives you 100 diplomatic relations with the High Elves, nullifying the aversion that they feel towards you. So, you want to make an alliance where you ally everyone in Ulthuan. It's hard, sure, especially with Tyrion, but Alariel, Elfarian, absolutely possible. So the diplomatic potential of Morathi is insane. The campaign potential of Morathi is something else, especially with the change from the Forge of the Cast Dwarves, because they took the instant construction that the Cast Dwarves have and added it to the Dark Elves. I do wish to stress out that what the system they had before that were still really good, but this is where we start getting into absurdities. Morathi's starting position, by the way, her starting province is very easy to deal with. She can avoid a war with Hexatl, she can avoid a war with Madre Estancia, or she can crush both of them if she so desires at the same time. Chew on that. We talk about like the biblical threat that Grimgor is. Grimgor's got nothing on Morathi, I have to tell you. But this isn't just about power. It's about campaign potential. It's about hero capacity. It's about units. It's how much do you need DLC. You don't really need DLC. Shadow and Blade would be a really worthwhile DLC to pick up because of the master heroes, but you might want to pick up that DLC anyway if you want to play a Skaven campaign down the line, because Snitch is the best Skaven campaign in the game. But still, what Morathi does, it's on a... It's like her power is through the stratosphere. She gets a minus 30% upkeep through the tenacious skill line. She gets more post-battle loot. She has an easy access to a port, so she can get the Black Ark Corsair. The Dark Elves get access to the Sacrifice of Cain, which gives you a ridiculous amount of casualty replenishment. And hell, you don't even need it, because with instant construction, you can do something like this. Oh, I have a tier 1 element in the Forest in Arheim. No problem. Let's make it tier 2 instantly, and soon enough tier 3. This is where things get absurd when we're talking about the Dark Elves. Like, let's go even further, right? Let's go. Slaves. Use them. And now I'm out of money, but soon enough I would be able to get hags, which would give casualty replenishment. The amount of power on display here cannot be understated. Like, and that's just the instant construction. You got dictats, which you can use slaves for, like 50 growth. This is like just the greenskins are powerful because they get 30 growth. To understand that through WA, you get 50 on top of instant construction, on top of a commandment that gives you 20. Yeah, Dark Elves are ridiculous. They're strong, they're powerful. Morathi's starting position allows you to dominate the area. Like, look at this campaign, just to give you an idea. I took my initial province, I'm marching against the Skaven, I've wiped out the Stankia, I actually took Skeggi to ally Hexatl to sell to Mazamundi, and I even paid a visit to Tyrion to wipe out their capital. That's in 14 turns. Very few Legendary Lords have this kind of potential. Like, there's a lot of different paths you can take, and not necessarily, and many of them are viable. It's very hard to lose at this campaign, but there's so much potential in this campaign. It's absurd. You want to take Ulthuan, like all of it, by like turn 40 if you're a really experienced player? You can do so. You want to conquer all of Dagroth and Ulthuan by like turn 60? You can do so if you know what you're doing, if you really want to know what you're doing. But even if you don't know what you're doing, you can really use this campaign to learn how to deal with various things, to deal with diplomacy, to deal with trade, because you don't want trade, to deal with economy, to deal with build orders, to deal with armies. There's just such a ridiculous potential over here to deal with Black Ark Corsairs, which are exclusive to the Dark Elves. It's like Creative Assembly just went with the Dark Elves, threw away the crap, because honestly, the Dark Elves in Warhammer 2 were not well designed from my perspective. I understand the love people have because they were able to get like 100k income per turn. I get that. I understand that. But you gotta admit, stacking heroes in the same province and stacking slaves in the same province was bullshit of the highest degree. That people might like that doesn't mean it wasn't bullshit. To be clear, what they're doing right now is a much better system, and don't believe any statement you might hear or any video you might hear talking about how the battles were bad. Like, I believed that then when Immortal Empires came out, and then I started playing them, and I'm like, holy shit, this is absurd. Like, it's on a different level. And what also makes Morathi incredible, she's got Slaaneshi corruption. She gets slaves per turn, and she gets an extra income from those slaves. And she causes attrition on her enemies. And her enemies are just going to fall like a sack of potatoes. The question of Morathi's campaign is not how you're going to win, but which factions you're going to eliminate and who you're going to dominate in the campaign. Those are the fundamental questions you're going to have to ask yourself when playing as Morathi in her campaign. It is ridiculous. To a degree, very few other campaigns are in this game. Like, look at this situation, just to give some context over here. I personally, like, over here, like, I'm just going to get another hero. So I've got 2 heroes over here. A black arc, which I'm building to get the full stack over here, slowly, but it's gonna be done. I've got 3 heroes here, 2 heroes here. That's 5. And then I've got 2 more heroes for a confederations, to be sure, just by declaring war on Taurox and getting Clark around on my side. Ridiculousness after ridiculousness to an absurd level that very few other campaigns have. This, like, giving the player this level of power and letting them go loose, but it's not like you can't screw up this campaign because Ulfwan is right next to you. Keep in mind that, like, you take it too slow in this campaign, Ulfwan unites and they're gonna throw everything in the kitchen sink against you. Enjoy fighting Alariel, Tyrion, and Ulfarian at the same time if you take it too slowly. This is not a campaign where you sit on your ass doing absolutely nothing. No, this is a campaign where you go out and expand and push aggressively, because if you don't, you're gonna be facing the Executioner's Blade. Quite literally, potentially over here, because Jan Bo is right to the south, and you might end up in a war with him. So yeah, it's a really fun campaign. It's got a lot of potential. You don't need DLC for it to make it fun. DLC does help. The Shadow and Blade specifically does help with the situation, but again, it's not mandatory to have a great campaign experience over here and to have a lot of potential, a lot of power, a lot of choices, a lot of flexibility, and a lot of different moving parts that you have to take account for, be it construction, slaves, your economy, your armies, your black arcs, just a lot of things to deal with. And yeah, the order tide that is present there in Ulfwan that is going to come for you if you let them. I wish I was tempted to put Morathi at the number 1 spot. The reason I didn't do so is simply because I think there is a better campaign area in the game than the one she starts with, just to explain that particular decision. So there's a better campaign area where you can learn to deal with more races than she has to deal with more campaign potential there. And beyond that, you do want DLC to really make the most out of this campaign. Like, you do want the Shadow and the Blade to make the most out of it. Works just fine without it, but really, if you want to push this campaign and really learn the game, get the Shadow and Blade and play it with that. And finally, and number 1, it is Zhao Ming of Grand Cafe. Now, I know what some people are going to say, oh, why didn't you put Tyrion? I explained why, but just to repeat myself, it has to do with the fact that you don't really need DLC to make Tyrion's campaign work in the best possible way, specifically to confederate Alariel and Alfarian. Also, I think Tyrion's campaign is just too safe, too comfortable over there in Ulfwan. It's great if you want an easy campaign, but if you want to learn the game, you do need to have some level of challenge present in that campaign. And I think Cafe, in general, achieves that, which is probably very appropriate, considering Cafe is all about balance. It's about balancing yin and yang. What's the benefit of yin? What's the benefit of yang? Well, yin gives you construction benefits. Yang gives you recruitment benefits. Balance gives you an upkeep and income benefit and campaign movement range. So it's great to play Cafe. They have a balanced army roster. They have flying units. They have artillery units. Good artillery units at that. Some of the best in the game. Good infantry. Good hero selection, at least in terms of magic, not in terms of melee capability. They do have the most expensive DLC in the game associated with them, but you don't need the DLC at all for Zhao Ming. The DLC is great if you want to play the best legendary Lord of Cafe, but for playing Zhao Ming's campaign, it's not important at all, really. I mean, a general choice, okay, fair enough, but again, you don't need the Celestial Generals to have a good campaign experience as Cafe. And the Jade and Jet Lions and Onyx Crowmen, well, Jade and Jet Lions really do offer you some campaign potential, some campaign choices, but they're not essential in any way, shape, or form. So you can certainly play Cafe with no DLC and have a fairly good experience. The soft rework did improve it. Before, I would not have recommended Cafe for a beginner just because the harmony system was utter trash, but there was always a lot of good things to say about playing Cafe even beforehand. There's a lot of potential. There's compass choices that give you casualty replenishment. You're going to have some issues with respect to this because it only goes up to 10% as opposed to 20% like Morathi can get. But as I stated, it's the balance. You don't want a Legendary Lord for a new player to just steamroll everyone in their path. Some of the Legendary Lords on this list absolutely do that with ease, without real effort. Whereas with Cafe, you do have to put some effort because you have Snitch. And anyone who underestimates Snitch is going to be in for a very rude awakening. Now, I've wiped them out over here, but Snitch can be an issue. Lokir can be an issue. And the reason I'm recommending this campaign is especially because of the design of Cafe as an area. You could just make a campaign you could cut off the entire rest of the map, the rest of the map with the exception of the caravan destinations, and still have a really good experience just playing a campaign as Cafe in Cafe, because you have a variety of terrain types. You've got deserts, you've got savanna, you've got some temperate climate over here to deal with. And you have a multitude of factions to tackle. You've got vampires, vampire counts, vampire coast. You've got dark elves, you've got Skaven, you've got wood elves, you've got lizardmen, you've got warriors of chaos, you have chaos dwarves, and hell, you even have ogres and Grimgor to the west. It's not even Greenskins, it's Grimgor. just to clear that up. So there's a lot of variety in this campaign. So you get to deal with a wide variety of different factions in this campaign. It can really work well if you're putting in the effort, if you're playing well, if you're pushing yourself, if you're maybe taking some risks. It pays off immensely. But you never end up in the farcical level like someone like Morathi does. It is a farce how powerful she can become. And you do have things to deal with like the Great Bastion. I strongly recommend Zhao Ming versus Miaoying. His starting position is better in every single way that matters. Sure, it's safer in that, but the faction effects are just flat out better. His campaign design is better. His campaign flow is better, like the territory he's taking, because you're gonna move from the wastelands into the warp zone desert, make a circle, come over here, you should take Shangyang and then march to the Shrine of Alchemist, then go for Taitsu, and then go after Snitch, and then go after Lokir, eliminate those threats, and confederate Cafe factions along the way. I've already confederate 2 Cafe factions already in this campaign, the Jade Custodians and the Imperial Wardens. And then yes, you do have that wide variety of opponents to deal with that do force you to adopt different battle tactics and tackle them differently. You're always going to want to get Jade Warriors and Jade Warrior Crossbowmen, to be sure, but fighting Dark Elves is not the same as fighting Lizardmen. So you're going to be forced in this campaign to deal with those threats. And again, you can have a fairly nice, comfortable campaign just in Cafe and deal with the multitude of threats here, unite the people, and then go steamroll the rest of the campaign map after turn, 50 or so. Maybe even earlier if you push yourself very, very hard. So lots of potential, lots of fun to be had here. As stated, lots of variety of terrain, and how you deal with that terrain. Navigating the rivers, for instance, is also important because you do have rivers in Cafe and they do play a role. So dealing with the naval aspect. It basically forces you to deal with a variety of different play styles and a variety of challenges that you would encounter, that you would not encounter in many other campaigns. Not to this extent. Regardless of whether or not you're an experienced player or a new player, Cafe is a great area to have a campaign in. Now, he's not the best Legendary Lord of Cafe, that goes to Yan Bo, by far, but he is certainly strong enough. He gets that 15 armor for melee units, he gets that hero recruit rank for alchemists, he gets that maximum cargo capacity, he gets more items through the Lord of the Jade Sword, Lord effect, magic item drop chance, 25% upkeep for melee units, diplomatic relations with Cafe. The ogre benefits he has are meaningless, sad to say, but he does have a lot of really solid benefits. He's powerful in battle, he's powerful on the campaign map, it just ends up being a great campaign to play. Like, Yambo certainly has the power, but I gotta say, like, I actually end up enjoying this campaign more for all of Yambo's potential. Like, Yambo, that split start is jarring to deal with, I have to say. You could decide to just play a Lustring campaign as Yambo, but that's kind of missing the point, I think, of playing a Cathayan campaign. So, yeah, Zhao Ming is the proper Ledgering Lord of Cathay that is in Cathay, that starts in Cathay. So it's not too far-fetched for Yambo to actually make his way back home and deal with Lustria later, either. So, regardless though, you could play any of the Cathayan Legendary Lords and it would still be a very solid experience, regardless of which one you decide to go for. So for a new player, it's not the best race, it's not the best faction, it's not the best lord, but it does strike that nice solid middle ground that I think a new player in particular does need. That's my perspective on it. Questine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more because there is more coming. More ridiculousness. I don't like how ridiculous certain factions are in Total War Warhammer 3, like Grimgor or Morathi. It's quite absurd. See you next time.